Americans looking to travel to Cuba could be doing so very, very soon, thanks to the Obama administration working with the Castros to lift any travel bans of U.S. citizens. Now, anyone who wants to travel to Cuba from the United States can still do so under very, very strict rules. But the new laws would basically allow commercial flights to go directly to Cuba. For those who traveled to Cuba in the past, they had to go through certain travel agencies, charter flights. They were carefully monitored by the U.S. Department of Commerce. Travelers had to present their visas, identification, and payment information to charter agents who handle the flights. And all travelers had to certify that their trip falls under one of 12 categories approved by the federal government. So if you're a journalist looking to go do a story in Cuba, you'd be able to do so.
Yeah.
But if you're just looking to do tourism in Cuba, you weren't able to do so. The U.S. is looking to lift that ban.
And in the past, a lot of folks would fly to Mexico or Canada first and then fly to Cuba because of those restrictions.
Right.
Yeah, and I guess at least they had the 12 categories. I remember I had the chance of going when I was a student at UConn. They had a group that went. But this is just one of, I mean, we talk about this every time there's this opening up. And there's been 10 different stories over the past year and a half from the Obama administration slowly stepping into the water of having normal relations. And the only reason we have to do this is we have a bunch of 60, 70, and 80-year-old legislators who still have a stick up their ass about stuff that hasn't happened in living memory for most people. And nobody, no young person, and once this gets changed, no one is going to look back and have any idea why any of this was necessary. It's such a nonsense series of reforms that has to happen.
Well, the embargo's point was to convince the people of Cuba and the Castros to end communism. And it did the exact opposite. It isolated Cuba from the United States, and it prevented the U.S. from doing what it does throughout the world, influencing every other country with our Western garbage, right? So eventually, I'm sure Cuba will change.
I object to the word garbage. I think the Quarter Pounder and cheese is great, and Nike makes nice sneakers.
I really want to monitor the obesity rates in Cuba. Like, compare the obesity rates now to, I don't know, 15, 20 years from now.
Yeah, once they get them Pop-Tarts. But yeah, like, we didn't... Europe and Japan, I mean, Japan, they've started to change in various ways, but they're super pro-American, and their pop culture for a long time was driven, clothing, music, by trends in America. We didn't get that by not talking to Europe and Japan. We just went there and we sold our products there and we shipped our music and our video games and our movies, and everyone's like, oh, this is pretty good.
Yep.
The same exact thing can happen in Cuba. This is the best possible thing that you can do if you want to topple communism in Cuba.
So first of all, the real reason we have these policies is not necessarily the 70, 80-year-olds. That's definitely a factor. But it's the Cuban Americans in South Florida predominantly that have a lot of money that they donate to politicians. So that money has been driving the Republican Party to say, oh, embargo, embargo, we must always keep the embargo. Because one more year and it's going to work, right? So the idea that if we fly planes into Cuba, right, that we allow travel into Cuba from America will prevent Cuba from collapsing and ending communism as we know. Come on, nobody, who believes that?
Yeah.
Nobody. Even if you got the most hard right Cuban American down in Miami in Little Havana, and you said, really, you think that if we make sure that planes don't fly in with tourists into Cuba, communism's going to collapse any second?
What if,
you really believe that? No, you don't.
Maybe if like Martin Shkreli visits, they'll be like, oh, I don't want any part of that. Let's stay communist.
And then finally, look, let's be sensible here. It's not like sanctions can't work. Sanctions can work, but you need an oligarchy. So in South Africa, for example, when we had apartheid and people said, okay, we're not going to deal with you anymore, that hurt a whole layer of upper income people in South Africa. And they said, well, if all of our businesses are hurt, now that's going to motivate us to drive towards change. But in a country that is largely a dictatorship, for example, Iraq, when Saddam Hussein was in power, those sanctions were never, ever going to work because Saddam was never going to run out of caviar. And it's the same for the Castros in Cuba, same in North Korea. They don't care that their population is in bad shape. They just care whether their fat ass is okay. And yes, Kim Jong-un's ass is, and the Castros are doing fine.
Right.
So these kind of things do not work in a situation like this. After decades of failure, can we not learn the most obvious lessons?
Right. There was this really interesting story of Cuban defectors, specifically baseball players, who decided to go back to Cuba, which, by the way, is risky to do, even now. They decided to go back to Cuba to like train little kids on how to play baseball. And I like that story because it shows you, like, you open up the doors or the floodgates, and the influence is going to go in. You know, there's no question about it. And you know, people who decided to come back to the come to the United States and leave their families behind are going to feel comfortable enough to go back and visit those people. I think this is good all around.
Yeah, and not to mention the economic benefits, obviously. I mean, when I see this, I think, you know, maybe take a little trip.
Yeah.
If you believe in America, then you should want more Americans going to Cuba and then being exposed to the American lifestyle more, because then you would think that the population would want to go more in our direction.
Yeah.
If you don't believe in America, well, then you want to prevent the Cubans from seeing it at all. So you make the call.